We don't get that many films which are set in ancient Egypt, so when one comes along that promises to take a somewhat grounded and realistic approach to its culture, you would hope that people get interested. Unfortunately, Exodus Gods and Kings opened to middling reviews, unsatisfactory box office performance, and general disinterest from the public. At an early point, it was faced with social media commentary around casting, and subsequently the film was banned in Egypt due to accusations of anti-Semitism and historical inaccuracies. There are plenty of reasons why they did that, which we can explore in another video.
Why are they white? What? I mean, they're Egyptian, right? Why are they white? Kaiba, stop activating the race card and listen!
The start of Exodus Gods and Kings is based on an actual historical event, the Battle of Kadesh, which took place early in the reign of King Ramesses II. This film presents a version of Kadesh, set during the time of Sety I. And because the battle itself is such a well-documented conflict, I thought it would be fun to go through this film's version and see how it lines up with the historical record. I actually haven't watched Exodus Gods and Kings since it came out in 2014, so along the way I'll also be reviewing my own thoughts. Is the film unfairly maligned, or is there more going on than we might think? Let's explore. To begin with, we're about 5.5 minutes into the film, when Ramesses and Moses are setting off as equal partners to attack the Hittites at Kadesh. The first thing I want to note about the production design is the chariots, which are quite beautifully realized in this film. The production designers seem to have looked at temple art commissioned by Ramesses himself, and specifically by color copies of those temple scenes made by artists in the early 1800s. About 200 years ago, much of the paint was still visible on the walls of Ramesses' temples, and travelers like Jean-François Champollion and Hippolyte Rossellini made color copies of the scenes, which allows the production design to replicate Ramesses' chariots somewhat faithfully. I want to give a special shout out to the quivers, which are decorated with lion symbols, just as Ramesses included in his art. The production designers could also look at actual chariots from ancient Egyptian tombs, like the chariot of Thutmose IV, of Yuya, and of Tutankhamun, all of which were discovered in their monuments and are now in museums in Cairo. And the depiction of the chariots in this opening sequence of the Battle of Kadesh is actually quite good. Just a couple of boys riding forth to war.
Your chariot away.
We can also give a shout out to the armor that Ramesses is wearing. It seems to be based on two designs that appear in the temple art. The first are these kind of bronze scales, painted gold here, which actually do survive archaeologically. There was a set of scale armor in the tomb of Tutankhamun, and archaeologists have also found pieces of this armor at different sites, both in Egypt, the Near East, and even the Mediterranean. On top of those scales, he also wears a kind of bird adornment that crisscrosses his chest. Again, this actually appears in Ramesses' temple art, and while it might be a depiction of certain goddesses protecting the king, it also could very well be a physical piece of armor that kings actually wore. So the design the artists have chosen here is actually quite appropriate for the time and for what Ramesses himself probably wore in battle. Now, let's talk weapons. Just before they go forth to war, Sety gives Moses and Ramesses a pair of swords. The design might seem unusual. Egyptian swords are often depicted as the curved khopesh, but these straight-bladed swords, with this particular design of handle, do show up archaeologically, especially during the Second Intermediate period, when the Hyksos, a type of Canaanite ruler, were dominating northern Egypt. So the design of the swords which Sety gives them is again quite appropriate for the time period, and it's not impossible that Ramesses himself actually had a sword similar to this. And now we come to the battle itself. The city of Kadesh is located in what is now Syria, at a site called Tel Nebi Mend. The town is famous for a great battle fought by Ramesses II in the 5th year of his reign. But technically, Ramesses was not the first king of Egypt to fight a battle there. In fact, his own father, Sety I, seems to have attacked Kadesh sometime during his 11-year reign. Sety depicted the battle on the walls of Karnak Temple, where the king rides forth in his chariot, trampling the foe and attacking the city itself. We know that this battle probably happened because in the 1920s, archaeologists working at Kadesh actually found a stela of King Sety I. He seems to have erected a monument in the city as a commemoration of his victory. That stela was later buried and survived for 3,000 years. So we can indicate that Sety fought a battle at Kadesh during his reign. In that sense, this film might be depicting that version of Kadesh, rather than the more famous one of Ramesses II. I don't think that's what they're going for, and I'll explain why in a few moments. But if you want to be technically correct, this could be the first Battle of Kadesh, rather than the famous one. Okay, so the Egyptian army approaches Kadesh. This is one of those moments where it looks like the film is making a mistake, but actually it's quite defensible. The Hittites and Egyptians did not use cavalry in battle, as far as we know, but they may have used them beforehand as scouts and messengers during their campaigns. Anyway, back to the battle. As they're scouting the terrain, Ramesses speaks to one of his generals.
Deploy Armor Division to the north, Ra Division to the center, Atar to the south. We hold Seth in reserve.
He mentions the 4 army divisions that he wants to deploy on the field. He names them as Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. These actually were the divisions that Ramesses II took to the Battle of Kadesh. They show up during the reign of his father, Sety, but the divisions of Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Sutech are attested during the actual conflict. What is different here is the deployment, and in fact the entire layout of the battle itself. As this film depicts it, the Egyptians make a surprise attack on the Hittite camp. The Hittites have established themselves somewhere near Kadesh, which is not shown, and Ramesses and Moses lead a direct assault on that encampment. In reality, it was kind of the opposite. What actually happened at Kadesh was that Ramesses II marched upon the city, and he did so in the belief that the Hittite army was actually far away, at the town which is now known as Aleppo. In reality, the king of Hatti, Muwatalli, had marched to Kadesh in secret, and as Ramesses and his army approached, strung out along the road, Muwatalli launched an ambush attack. It was almost a decisive loss for the Egyptians, and it was only thanks to some lucky troop movements and timing, and a pretty fierce chariot battle around the Egyptian camp, that Ramesses was able to extricate himself and force a stalemate on the battlefield. Ultimately, Kadesh was a strategic defeat for Ramesses, but the fighting on the day was quite fierce, and the king himself seems to have been involved personally. So, as we're about to see in this version of the battle, things are kind of flipped back to front. The Egyptians are attacking the Hittites instead of the other way round, and the whole setup of the battle is quite different. Okay, so one thing that I meant to talk about, but completely forgot, was Ramesses' helmet. He seems to be wearing a golden vulture. Now, this does actually show up in ancient Egyptian art from the Ramessid period, but it doesn't belong to kings or princes. Instead, this actually belongs to queens. You'll find this golden vulture in places like the tomb of Nefertari, who was Ramesses' wife. I'm not sure why they've given him this golden vulture when they could have given him something like the blue crown, which is the most common headgear that Ramesses wears in battle. Maybe they were trying to avoid the blue crown since Ramesses is not king yet, but if that is the logic, then why give him a queen's helmet? It's one of those examples that makes Exodus, Gods and Kings such a strange movie. The production designers have clearly looked at tomb art and reliefs and made their costuming based on some actual examples. But then they've also made some really weird choices in terms of who gets what outfit and when they wear it.
And now for something completely different.
So the Egyptian army begins to approach Kadesh. We get a glimpse of Muwatalli himself, or the man who I assume is supposed to be Muwatalli. Looking at him, you might think, what the hell is that depiction?
By the knobbly knees of Ramesses, what being of purest edge is this?
It seems to come from the Egyptian temple art. Depictions on the walls of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt often show Hittite charioteers with these long mullet-style haircuts, and mustaches. It's not quite as dramatic as the version they've gone with for the film, but according to Ramesses' own depiction, this is what, supposedly, Hittite warriors looked like. Again, I think the production designers have used this art as the template for designing their costumes and makeup. At least in this case, they're going with Ramesses' own version. At this point, the battle begins to unfold. The Hittites begin assembling in their camp as the alarm is raised, and we even see a soldier applying grease to one of the chariot axles, and the infantry lining up in their camp to repel the Egyptians. Again, horseback riders were probably used primarily for scouts and for messengers, rather than as an attack force, but, it adds to the drama, so that's fine. And now we get the Egyptian chariots charging forward, driving headlong towards the Hittite camp. In the historical battle that Ramesses recorded, it seems like the Hittites did actually crash over the walls of the Egyptian camp and enter the precinct itself. So again, since the production designers have flipped the relationship in this battle with the Hittites coming under attack, we see Ramesses doing what the Hittites did in reality. What's interesting here is that chariots are not best suited to an attack on a camp. They primarily rely on mobility, and they need a great deal of space in order to maneuver. So in the historical battle, the Hittites probably made a mistake when they charged the Egyptian camp. They were hoping to catch the pharaoh unawares and capture or kill him. But as we see Ramesses doing it, it does suggest something interesting about his character. Earlier, we did see Ramesses ignoring the advice that Moses was giving to concentrate all of his forces on one singular attack. And here, as Ramesses and his chariots charge headlong into the Hittite camp, that's not an ideal use of chariots. You could read this as a mistake, but I think it's meant to convey a bit more of character, in the sense that Ramesses is overconfident and even arrogant, and not necessarily experienced with what his war chariot is capable of. Anyway, having made their charge on the Hittite camp, the Egyptians now begin to withdraw, and we get these sweeping scenes of them curving around through the camp as they begin to depart the battlefield. It's all over relatively quickly, whereas in reality, we know the Battle of Kadesh actually took place over about 2 days. The first attack by the Hittites took up most of the afternoon, and they only withdrew as the sun began to set. Then on the second day, there was another clash between the pharaoh and Muatali, and they basically fought each other to a standstill before mutually agreeing to withdraw from the site. Now, we may be wondering, why has Ridley Scott and his production design chosen to show the Battle of Kadesh this way? Why have they not gone with a more historically accurate depiction, which is the sudden Hittite ambush and Ramesses having to extricate himself? Obviously, historical accuracy always gives way to creativity and storytelling. This is entertainment after all. But even from a storytelling perspective, the Hittite ambush is far more dramatic and exciting than what we actually get in the film. So why have they gone with this version? I suspect what has happened here is that the scriptwriter, or maybe Ridley Scott, has decided to do an homage to Lawrence of Arabia. The staging of the Battle of Kadesh here is strikingly similar to the attack on Aqaba that occurs in that earlier film. In some places, the cinematography is almost one for one. It's done on a larger budget and with far more CGI, but when you look at the shot composition, they often seem almost one for one. I suspect that what happened is that at some point the scriptwriter and director decided that the historical version of Kadesh was too elaborate and detailed for this opening action sequence. And as they decided to simplify it, Scott may have got the idea to do this kind of modern update of Lawrence of Arabia. The similarities are so close that I don't think they're a coincidence.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
So the film depicts Kadesh as an overwhelming victory. Again, if you want to be technically correct, you could say this was the attack under Sety I, which probably was an overwhelming victory. But since it involves Ramesses, I think we can say that this is meant to be the Battle of Kadesh that he fought, in which case the script has gone way off the historical record. Again, I'm really not sure why they did that. Unless it was to simplify and streamline things, the actual historical version of Kadesh is way more interesting and dramatic than what we get here. So from an entertainment perspective, it would have been much more exciting on screen. But they made their choices, and now we all have to live with them. At the very least, this next part is actually quite fun. As we move back to the palace, we see a scribe describing an extended papyrus, which recounts the events of the battle. Notably, what he's describing actually does come from Ramesses' own account. The scribe even makes a quote of the king being alone, with no soldiers or shield bearer to protect him. That actually comes, almost verbatim, from Ramesses' Kadesh poem. The same is true for some of the art. The figures of charioteers riding forth can be found on Ramesses' temples, and his depictions include both Hittite and Egyptian chariots, giving a sense of the massive scale of the battle. Notably though, there is a weird inconsistency in what the scribe is saying versus what we just saw on screen. The narrative that the scribe is telling suggests that the Hittites had initiated the attack, breaking through to the Egyptian camp. That makes me wonder if the original script actually had the Battle of Kadesh unfolding in a more historically accurate format, and when they changed the dynamics of that battle, they didn't notice that this particular scene was now inconsistent with the description. It's not exactly a big deal, but it makes me wonder if the original version did have something closer to what actually happened. So the scribe carries on describing bits of the artistic sequences, and wait, what is that? Is that ships? Why are there ships at the Battle of Kadesh? The version we just saw on film took place in the middle of a desert canyon, so what's going on here? This, I think, might be quite a fun mistake. What you see in this image does come from a temple belonging to Ramesses, but not Ramesses II. This image comes from a temple of Ramesses III, specifically his great monument at Medinet Habu. Ramesses III, who lived almost 100 years after Ramesses II took power, was famous for fighting battles against the Sea Peoples, and when he depicted the Sea Peoples on the walls of his temples, he showed them in these boats, engaging in battle just like we see here. I think what has happened is that someone on the production design has got confused between Ramesses II and Ramesses III, and accidentally conflated all of that art into one hodgepodge for the Battle of Kadesh. It's a very strange inconsistency, especially given that the film we saw just showed a battle in the middle of the desert. But, to give them some credit, at least they were looking at Egyptian historical imagery and using that as their basis. The images of the Sea Peoples in their boats are accurate to Ramesses III's temples. They're just not quite accurate to the Battle of Kadesh 100 years earlier. It's so random, and the thought process is so clear, but you probably wouldn't notice it unless you were especially familiar with Egyptian temple art. Anyway, wrapping up. Ramesses claims that he achieved the victory all by himself with only the assistance of the gods, which starts to feed into the drama of the film that is to come. But as we come to the end of this Battle of Kadesh sequence, I do want to give one last shout out. We get a return of Hassan Massoud, who appeared in Ridley Scott's film Kingdom of Heaven. In that film, he played the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin, but here he takes on the role of Passer. Passer is a historical figure. He was the Chatti, or Vizier, kind of like the Prime Minister, in the later years of Sety I and the first 20 years of Ramesses II. Monuments of Passer survive from his tomb, which is in Luxor, and even from the Serapeum at Saqqara, where the burials of the Apis bulls took place. Passer is a particularly well-documented individual from Ramessid Egypt, and the fact that Hassan Massoud plays him is just a nice little bit of icing on the cake. So it's a good place to finish on a positive note. So the Battle of Kadesh, as it appears in Exodus, Gods and Kings, is quite a strange little set piece. On the one hand, we have some lovely attention to detail in terms of the chariots, the swords, the armor. On the other hand, we have a rendition of the battle that is completely different from the version recorded in Ramesses' own accounts. Based on the little continuity errors in the final scene, make me suspect that the film originally had a more fully realized version of the battle, but it was cut down both for time, simplicity, and maybe because Ridley Scott wanted to do an homage to Lawrence of Arabia. It could be all of those reasons, could be none of them, but the version of Kadesh that we get is an interesting mix of genuine historical details with directorial decisions that are kind of strange in hindsight. Ultimately, the major sin of this version of Kadesh is that it's kind of boring. The Egyptians charge into the Hittite camp, Ramesses is almost overwhelmed until Moses saves him, and then the battle basically ends. There is no strategy or tactical decision making, and the fight itself is not particularly compelling. So I have to wonder why they bothered to include it at all. So it unfortunately winds up being one of those action sequences where you just kind of think, what was the point of that? Like, it establishes a few things about the plot, but we don't really learn anything about the characters, and what is shown on screen isn't particularly exciting or memorable. Honestly, the Battle of Kadesh itself is so well recorded from Ramesses' temples and inscriptions that you could probably make a full movie just about that one event. In fact, if you're interested to learn more about the Battle of Kadesh, I did a movie-length history of it on the History of Egypt podcast. Additionally, I also did a live stream about the art of Kadesh, which Ramesses put onto the walls of his temples. If you want to see that, there'll be a link in the description. So hopefully this version of the Battle of Kadesh can at least be a window to learning more about the historical event, which at the end of the day is the best thing that can be achieved with a historical film. They can never be truly accurate, but on a good day, they can stimulate people to learn more about the actual events which inspired them. Hopefully, this discussion of Exodus Gods and Kings can do that for you. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.